What's going on, guys? My name is Wade with TechDaily, and in this video, we are checking out the new Samsung Galaxy A35. Now, there's a couple of important things you need to know about this phone. First off, to state the obvious, this is the successor to last year's A34, which was quite popular as sort of a mid-range, bang-for-your-buck Samsung device. The A30-something phones in previous years fell really right smack dab in the middle of Samsung's A-series lineup, flanked by the cheaper, lesser-spec'd A20-somethings and other budget options, and falling just a bit short of the higher-tier A50-somethings and A70-somethings. However, the A70-somethings have since been withdrawn from the A-series lineup, and this year, the new A55, which was also announced alongside this guy, is unfortunately not coming to the US and some other regions at all. So that means, for a good chunk of A-series buyers, this new A35 is now the highest-end A-series option. And that's a little weird. Samsung definitely has a crowded lineup of smartphones, so some thinning out or restructuring was probably inevitable, but it feels a little weird when you consider the fact that the next step up from this A35 is now the $600 S23 FE. With that consideration, it'd be fair to think that Samsung vastly improved or otherwise significantly changed this new A35 to maybe more closely resemble the higher-end devices. But spec for spec, this phone isn't far off from what we saw on the A34 last year, so whether you're looking to upgrade or looking for a new phone entirely, this may be a less enticing device than in years past, but I'm definitely getting ahead of myself here. Let's first just quickly unbox this new A35, and then I'll break down everything else you need to know so you can decide for yourself if this is the device for you. Ripping off the stickers and sliding off the lid, the first thing we get is the phone itself, of course, and then, well, nothing else inside the actual box, but inside the lid, you will find that familiar packet stamped with the Samsung logo, with the SIM ejector tool fashioned to the outside of it, and then inside, really the only accessories you still get with these phones nowadays, a big stack of paperwork and a USB-C cable, and that's pretty much everything. So here is the A35 itself once again, and I first want to touch on pricing and availability since, like I explained a moment ago, it's sort of different than in previous years. The price for the A35 is around $369. I'm sort of going off of the UK launch price and converting, and also referencing the handful of third-party retailers who already have this A35 listed for sale, because we technically don't yet have the actual US specific price directly from Samsung. This device will ultimately be sold and shipped by Samsung at some point though, and with it being a US focused smartphone, we can also expect to see various carriers and prepaid networks offering it with all sorts of deals and discounts. There's 128 and 256 gigabyte storage options, as well as 6 and 8 gig RAM options to choose from to configure this phone, so keep an eye out for those specs as you shop around, and if you do want to do some comparison shopping of your own, I'll leave some links down below in the video description to where you can get this phone at its cheapest current price. The new A35 is the same size device as last year's A34. It's 6.6 inches corner to corner, at least the screen is, and you still have those somewhat noticeable black borders that frame it for a screen-to-body ratio of not quite 85%. To Samsung's credit though, this tier of A-series looks more modern and premium from the front than it did in years past, and I think most folks will fully appreciate getting something this big for such a relatively affordable price tag. Around back, not much has changed here, at least not visually, though the A35 does get a slight upgrade in materials. The back cover is now all glass. And actually, the front glass is an upgraded material too, Gorilla Glass Victus Plus. This adds some 10 grams of weight to this phone, which certainly makes it feel heavier and more premium, but the frame of the phone, what you see underneath the remaining bits of stickers that I peel off there, that's still plastic. though it feels far from cheap. So you don't get the full high-end build, like the new A55 with its aluminum form factor, but this A35 is now one step closer to the higher S-series phones with its overall build. Also, I opted for the lemon colorway, which leans more towards a light shade of green in person, but I think because of the glass back, it doesn't have as obvious of a holographic rainbow or color shifting effect like the product images make it seem. It just looks a bit duller by comparison. Taking a look around, at the top you have the dual SIM and SD card tray. One side is your main SIM, and the flip side has a spot for either a secondary SIM or an SD card, dealer's choice. The A35 also supports eSIM, so you have options here for sure, and it's great to still have the SD card side, especially since you can double or triple the storage capacity on this phone for pretty cheap. There's nothing on the left side of the phone. On the right side, the standard volume and power buttons, of course. At the very bottom, there's the USB-C port for charging, the main loudspeaker, and a big empty waste of space that could totally have a headphone jack. Up towards the top above the selfie camera is the secondary speaker and earpiece, and around back, a triple lens camera setup that we'll test out in just a bit. Now, when it comes to that big old display, Samsung didn't really upgrade anything here from last year, but to be totally honest, I'm not so sure what they could have even added. The 6.6-inch screen is an awesome Super AMOLED panel, coming in at the full HD 2340 by 1080 resolution, packing in some 390 pixels per inch, and it is a 120 Hz high refresh rate display. Those specs are basically what you get on Samsung's $800 S24. Seriously. So if screen quality is your primary concern, not only are you getting some crazy value here, but you're actually getting a top-tier viewing experience in general. The AMOLED panel means that colors look punchy and vibrant. Even though it's massive, the 1080 resolution ensures you won't be picking out any pixels, even if you want to stare at your screen from an inch away from your nose. And the 120 Hz option keeps the taps, touches, swipes, and other visuals fast and fluid. On top of all that, the screen peaks out at around 1000 nits of brightness, which arguably isn't that bright. The S-series phones do get way brighter, so if you want to find some difference, there it is. But for an A-series phone, the screen is bright, and I think the upgraded Gorilla Glass Victus Plus cuts down on glare and fingerprints a bit more too. One thing about Samsung having so many phones is that eventually the specs do start to overlap. So the screen on this phone is actually the exact same as what's on the A55, and like I said earlier, the same as the S-series devices. And with that in mind, I think you can see why I consider a phone like this to be a crazy value. Year after year, it's the screen alone that really sells this phone, and I think that's once again the case this year. Also, underneath the display is your fingerprint sensor for unlocking and getting into the phone. It's still not the flagship caliper ultrasonic sensor, it's the old school optical deal, but it's fast enough so long as you give it that extra fraction of a second to tap and hold on the screen. And paired with Face Unlock too, you can pretty much get into the phone instantly nearly every time. For your out loud listening pleasure, the dual speaker setup on this phone is about what you'd expect. Samsung has never really highlighted the speakers on any of their phones, at least not for a while, and while I'm glad the dual speaker setup is still on this, above 80 or 85%, it's a bit distorted and muffled like it's always been. Here's a quick sound sample so you can hear it for yourself. As far as the specs and performance, well, this is another case of good news, bad news, just like we saw with the new A55. The good news is the A35 did get a faster, new-ish processor, but the bad news is it's Samsung's own Exynos 1380, rather than a MediaTek or Snapdragon that I know a lot of other people might prefer. In fact, this is the same processor that last year's A54 had, which kind of sort of ended up being that phone's biggest sticking point, what people complained about most. Here are the Geekbench scores for said Exynos processor, so you can maybe compare it to what you have at home. With this not being a totally new processor, we already sort of know how it's going to perform, and Let's be honest, will 95% of people care what's inside this phone? No, not at all. If your main usage consists of Snapchatting and Twitter scrolling and YouTube video watching, this is going to be a better than average phone for sure. If you're in the small subset of people though who expects the best possible performance for gaming, multitasking, or other high intensity or graphics heavy things, then you probably already know the minor limitations this chipset offers, and you have another device in mind. So take that for what it's worth, but for all intents and purposes, this is a phone that will perform perfectly well, and will likely continue performing well for years to come. Samsung promises 4 major Android updates for this phone and 5 total years of regular security updates, so you'll be getting all the latest Android and One UI features for quite some time. Like I always say, that makes this phone a decent sort of long-term hold if you aren't in the mood to fork over $400 every single year. And it further cements the value proposition of a phone like this. For basically half the price, you get a full-fledged, full-featured Android and Samsung experience that won't be feeling sluggish or outdated any faster than any other Samsung device. The A35 is also powered by a decent-sized 5000 mAh battery, which, don't get me wrong, I'm super glad to see. That's a lot of power for this phone, and it'll keep you going well beyond a full day under normal, casual usage. But we've had 5000 mAh batteries year after year on these phones, and Samsung still hasn't introduced any of the other power features from its flagship phones. Your only charging option is yet again 25-watt wired fast charging, which is good so long as you provide your own fast charger to pair with it, since Samsung doesn't have one in the box, and there's still no wireless charging on this phone here either. Finally, when it comes to the camera setup, the triple lens deal around back appears to be the same as last year with one minor exception. The main lens gets swapped out. It's a 50 megapixel shooter instead of the 48 megapixel from the A34, though this doesn't appear to be the same 50 megapixel main lens from the A54. It has a slightly different sensor size. The rest of the setup though is all the same. There's the 8 megapixel 123 degree ultra wide secondary lens, which I always like to have, and a 5 megapixel macro lens for super close pictures. The selfie camera remains unchanged as well. It's still a 13 megapixel f2.2 aperture lens, and inside the camera app, there's honestly nothing in here with the shooting modes and other features that indicate any changes or upgrades. There are a couple of things that are better than budget, like 4K video recording and the 50 megapixel picture mode, and enhanced video stabilization thanks to the gyro EIS system. And there's also nearly a dozen other options to play around with, like Pro Video, Night Mode, and Super Slow-Mo that further elevate the camera setup in a way beyond its mid-range or budget distinction. However, everything here we've seen before, and there are other smartphones in this price range with crazy powerful camera setups now. Samsung made big leaps with their A-series cameras for a couple of years, from like the A31 to the A33, but the last couple of years, I think everyone else pulled further ahead, and they aren't bringing anything new or exciting that closes the gap between their own flagship S-series cameras and some of their international smartphone competitors. But hey, these are still some pretty decent looking shots from a very affordable phone, and I'll be doing some further camera comparisons and testing in the coming weeks to really see what this phone can do. The A35 this year, to me, is unfortunately a device that has a lot to live up to. For us US customers, this is now the highest spec option before entering into the realm of the S series. So this phone, for better or for worse, will be compared to the S23 FE or even the S24. I don't think that's a bad thing at all, actually, and might actually entice more people to opt for this phone when you consider everything you get for half the price. The all-glass build, the solid display, the decent specs, the perfectly usable camera setup. Samsung says they want more people to opt for the FE, but this honestly might have the exact opposite effect. For the rest of the world, I feel like this phone is so close to the A55 that you guys get that it also might make more sense to just get the A35 instead. But that phone has, I think, just enough over this one to justify getting it. Perhaps a direct comparison is in order for a future video, but what do you guys think of the new A35? Is this a phone you're interested in right now? Do you have one already? Let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts, of course. Be sure to follow TechDaily on Twitter and subscribe to the TechDaily YouTube channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys later.